I don't think you can talk about political geography, at least not at this point in history, without saying something about terrorism. So that's what I'm going to talk about right now. It's kind of a weird topic, and some people have different views on what terrorism actually is, but I'm just going to try and go through this academically. Let's start with this, though. When I was in college at Long Beach State doing my undergraduate work, I took a political geography class. This was the textbook that we used. That textbook was written in the 1970s and 1980s. And I want you to notice this, that in the table of contents, there's nothing about terrorism. We did not even speak about terrorism in that class. It's hard to imagine a political geography class taught at the upper division level at this point in history, a few decades into the 21st century, without discussing terrorism. But you have to remember, at that point in the United States, we had experienced terrorist acts, but not like what happened on September 11, 2001. And as a result of that, it really changed the way Americans especially think about and thought about terrorism. So it's kind of a topic that you have to look at least a little bit. All right, so there's something called the Geneva Convention. Now this actually goes back into the 1800s, but after World War II, which ends in 1945, because it was such a horrendous war and because of what happened at Nuremberg and the Nuremberg trials and what came out with Nuremberg and how awful people were to each other during that war, specifically targeting civilians, the Geneva Convention in 1949 essentially sets down the rules for war. I know it seems crazy that there could be rules in war, but there are actually rules in war, what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do, which brings us to terrorism and what it is. I'm going to define it basically like this. It's any violent act by individuals or by organizations that are designed to target unsuspecting, non-combatant civilians, regardless of the goals of the people committing these acts. Now, you have to understand something about this, that it can come in a variety of forms. And as I just mentioned, it could be individuals or it could be groups. But terrorists are really trying to achieve some kind of objective. And they probably, in most cases, feel like they cannot take on a government's military straight up. So what they do is they go after what would be considered, I guess, the soft underbelly of society. And the idea is that you spread fear. Now, terrorist groups or terrorism or terrorists can be political, economic, religious, ethno-cultural, others, and as you can imagine, all of these things can blur together depending on what's going on and what the ultimate goals are of the terrorists themselves. But regardless, it's always about spreading fear and anxiety, and that can come through bombings or hijackings or kidnappings or taking hostages or assassinations, or blowing things up in pizza parlors where there's innocent civilians hanging around. The violence on the part of the terrorists is seen as something that's necessary to achieve their goals. And the way they hope to achieve their goals is by spreading fear and anxiety in the society amongst the civilian population so that there's pressure put on a government to then do what the terrorists want them to do. That's the ultimate goal. But it is really about scaring people. You can imagine, just think about this on your own life. If going to a mall or going to a movie or going to wherever it is that you would congregate, to a restaurant, meant that you were taking your life into your hands every time you did that, obviously what's going on is that these people would be succeeding because they would be scaring you into putting pressure on the government or whatever organization it is to try and either stop this or else allow them and accede to what their goals are. As I said, on September 11, 2001, this really kind of hit home for the United States with the September 11th attacks. And as a result of that, it's kind of been on Americans' minds. So there are terrorist groups, of course, but there are various levels of organization, from tightly controlled to loosely operating sympathetic groups or individuals. It's not always really tightly controlled, very organized group. Sometimes it's not very organized at all. It's just kind of sympathetic attacks, or somebody gets something crazy in their head, like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, did. So the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, would have been an example of something that was very tightly controlled. And ISIS, everybody's familiar with that. ISIS is a much more loosely controlled organization because they would be willing to accept terrorist acts against mostly Western targets under any circumstances. And they don't care who does it as long as they're getting credit for it. The IRA did not operate like that. If there was an attack, the IRA wanted complete control over what was happening because they wanted to control the message as tightly as possible. Now, the recent evolution of terrorism, I say recent because, terrorism kind of goes back forever in a lot of ways. You can imagine before the Geneva Conventions in 1949, before World War II, basically war was a version of rape and pillage. You could just thrash whatever you wanted to thrash and destroy whatever you wanted to destroy. And it was the stronger side got to do whatever they wanted to do. But after World War II, because it was so horrific, there was an attempt to try and control the way war worked, so that individual civilians, old people, children, were not just targeted in an attempt to bring pressure on the society and cause the opposing side to collapse. So for the 1960s and 1980s, it was mostly political and economic. It was groups like the Baader-Meinhof gang, which operated in Germany, and the Red Army faction operated in Germany, in West Germany, I mean. They were communists, essentially. The Irish Republican Army, which although tied to the Catholics, also had kind of a communist bent to it, and many of the people in it were not religious at all. The Ulster Defence Force, which was the opposite of that in Northern Ireland, they represented the Protestants, but at the same time, not overly religious necessarily. The Weather Underground, which operated in the United States, the Symbionese Liberation Army, which got taken down in Los Angeles. These are mostly political and economic groups. The Palestinian Liberation Organization was kind of a political and economic group operating on the side of the Palestinians against the Israelis and anybody else who supported the Israelis, which of course means the United States. But it began to evolve, and from the 1980s onward, there began to be more of a religious component to this. So it became political, economic, religious, ethnocultural, all those things kind of blended together with Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, ultimately Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. Of course, in the United States in 1995, there was the Oklahoma City bombing. That was a very loosely organized thing conducted by a few individuals. It wasn't actually a terrorist group like something large like the IRA or Hezbollah. And we all know on January 6, 2021, there was an attack on the United States government in an attempt to overthrow the government. I consider this a terrorist attack. They were attempting to overthrow a legitimately elected government. And of course, this was baited by this wacky organization, QAnon, or whatever you want to call it, the one guy who's in charge of it, who's handed it back and forth between him, his dad, and some guy in South Africa. So what about state sponsoring of terrorism, as in a government sponsoring? Because you can imagine if you're going to, build bombs and have arms, you have to pay for this stuff. Well, state sponsoring of terrorism means either providing sanctuary for terrorists who might be wanted by other countries, or supplying terrorists with weapons or money or intelligence, or planning attacks using terrorists. So it kind of depends on how much action you are getting from a government. But I think in the United States, we see things like what's happened in Pakistan, where Osama bin Laden was killed, that they seem to have been at least looking the other way with what was happening in Pakistan and Al-Qaeda. I think in addition to that, the United States generally looks at Iran as being a state sponsor. Iraq, prior to Saddam Hussein being overthrown, was a state sponsor of terrorists. I think we know that Libya under Muammar Gaddafi, who is now dead, was a state sponsor of terrorists. They even admitted as much. It was a 1986 bombing of a nightclub in Berlin that had a lot of American military personnel in it. They blew up the Pan Am 103 jet that was flying over the top of Scotland from England coming to the United States. They planted bombs on other planes. So, that's really kind of state sponsoring of terrorism. Now, what's the difference between this and an insurgency? Well, generally, insurgencies would be seen as something where people are fighting an occupying military force, or at least what they perceive as an occupying military force. And it really comes down to what are the targets. If the targets are the military, this is generally considered to be a legitimate target because the military can fight back. But strapping a bomb to your body and getting on a bus and blowing yourself up does not work the same way. That is attempting to kill civilians for the purpose of terrorizing the society. And they are not capable of fighting back. They're just unsuspecting on a bus or any other circumstance like that, on an airplane, flying the plane into a building. These are all about unsuspecting civilians who cannot fight back. When you're fighting against a military, a straight up military that is armed and has the ability to fight back, that is a different type of action. Regardless of what anybody thinks about what the purposes are or the long-term goals, those are different actions.